Ever since its early days, the modern music industry has always been quite the confusing beast, with it developing in strange and unique ways all around the world. And while the industry can be pretty peculiar at times in the West, when it comes to J-pop, it's a different world altogether. In fact, I'd even go as far to say that the two are practically polar opposites. Well, today, while we'll still be looking at the fan culture surrounding it, let's also take a look at the one factor driving it all, the industry. Hello everyone, this is the RPG Monger, and today we'll be diving into the wild world of idol culture. First off, what is idol culture exactly as it relates to J-pop? Well, like always, let's start from the very beginning. Having roots as far back as the 60s, with the very first idol recruitment agency, Johnny & Associates, founded in 1962, idol culture and the industry around it has been around for quite some time. And while it's always appeared pretty simple on the surface, the deeper you dig into it, the more complicated it all gets. Though what differentiates an idol from any other music star that rises up? Well, it's pretty hard to pinpoint an exact characteristic, but more often than not, it's their age. To give a definition of the extremely broad term, idols most commonly consist of talented young singers or actors who usually begin their rise to fame within their teenage years. Of course, this isn't absolute, and in more recent times, exceptions to this have popped up, like with idol groups in their mid-30s and all the idols who are solely on the internet, though we'll get to those later. Back into the history lesson, with the groundwork beginning to be laid out in the 60s as more and more Japanese households got TVs, once the 70s hit, it couldn't be a more perfect time for idols to hit the scene. As with the semi-recently successful French starlet Sylvie Vartan becoming a teenage sensation all over the world, in Japan specifically, people became more than inspired to replicate the phenomenon. And it wouldn't just be a singular handful of stars that dominated the decade like other music industries at the time either, since through the glamorous and desirable idol lifestyle marketed to the masses, dozens of young teenagers would end up being recruited into the factory that was the idol industry. Just take Momoe Yamaguchi, the first idol to experience widespread success, who just through sending a postcard to a popular talent search show, became an idol at the young age of 13. However, while the idol industry portrayed itself as the purveyor of dreams for all the young people wishing to become famous, in reality, things weren't as glamorous as people were led on to believe. To the public, idols were almost always shown as absolutely flawless individuals who enjoyed luxuries the common person could only dream of getting their hands on. Of course, aside from that being a tactic to capture the Japanese public, this also served as a great way to entice more and more teens into the industry. Though in actuality, everything from their public appearances to the activities in their private lives were all meticulously orchestrated and controlled. For the majority of the time, they'd constantly be under the watchful eye of their promoters, preventing them from actually living the lifestyle they were shown to be living. And it doesn't end there, since alongside being very overworked, when it came to actual compensation for their hard work, idols would often be severely underpaid, even when they'd have a song do well. Of course, there are exceptions to this, like with the aforementioned Momoe Yamaguchi, who'd become so widely popular that she transcended the entire industry. But when it came to the majority of idols who never saw that kind of success, this was the sad truth of their experience. Plus, alongside that, in the early days of the idol industry, many young idols who didn't become popular would end up being forced to work as hostesses, cabaret dancers, and even prostitutes due to the predatory contracts they'd unknowingly signed. However, thankfully, conditions wouldn't be this terrible forever, as soon in came the 80s, a decade that would be host to a ton of changes for the entirety of Japan. Let me explain. Up until now, Japan's economy had been growing pretty rapidly due to a variety of factors, with it going from its severely wounded state after World War II to the second largest economy in the world by the 60s, only further growing in the decades to come. So taking that into consideration, although the ride did have a few bumps in it and would soon come to to quite the catastrophic halt due to Japan's bubble economy, in the 80s, Japan was doing spectacularly. Back to the idols though, as a side effect of the country's booming economy, the idol industry absolutely exploded. Whereas they had a pretty decent presence in the music industry before, by the 80s, just about all of J-pop was completely taken over by idols, with the culture around them exploding alongside. To give a comparison, while before in the 70s, a single year would be host to a couple semi-successful idols, in the 80s, 1 year would be host to upwards on 50 new and popular idols, with them being replaced just as quickly as they debuted. Plus, alongside the booming economy, idols would now begin receiving a variety of big-name commercial endorsements as well, definitely playing a big part in the industry's explosion. Though what about the idols themselves? Were conditions still just as poor as they'd been in the 70s? Well, thankfully, not exactly. You see, things still weren't the best since the industry continued to control most aspects of the idols' lives, but unlike before, they were actually decently compensated. This would partially be due to the abandonment of the previous image of glitz and glamour in favor of a much more relatable stance, with idols being allowed to display more of their actual personality. Unfortunately, most of everything would still be very scripted, but it was a definite improvement. Now, even if you weren't a smash hit with the Japanese populace, you'd still be paid fairly for your work. Hell, at this point, idols had become so widespread throughout Japan that now the 80s are even regarded as the golden age of idols. But on that note, what goes up must always go down, because with the coming of the 90s, idols would begin to fade away from the mainstream, only retaining a more niche audience. Though how did this happen exactly? Well, there are quite a few reasons. Firstly, the music industry itself, as instead of preferring idols whose looks would end up being one of the main selling points of their music, the industry began shifting more towards bands and rock musicians whose sales were more tied with the quality of their music rather than how cute the members were. In turn, alongside this, while female idols would wane in the 90s, male idol groups would end up becoming more popular than ever before. And again, like with the previous 2 decades, as times changed, so would the marketing strategies employed by idol agencies. Because while previously idols were shown to be above the average person both in lifestyle and looks, in the 90s, agencies completely changed this model again in favor of a much more relatable stance. Since with the main audience for idols shifting as well, 90s idols were marketed as just everyday people who happened to be talented in a certain way. To give an example, whereas before idols could only be seen using expensive products, in the 90s they could admit that they actually enjoy everyday food and that they don't exclusively shop at extremely expensive stores. And like I said before, this was all mostly done to make idols appeal to their new target audience, adult male otaku. But we'll get to that soon. As idols in the 90s became younger than ever before, and soon to be huge groups like Morning Musume were formed, now we're in the 2000s. Making a swift recovery from the 90s, in Japan, idols have once again become widely popular in the mainstream, all the while somehow maintaining and growing its large audience of otaku. How they're doing it exactly? Well, it all comes down to idol culture itself. So now that we've tackled the idol industry and the ways it's evolved, it's time to plunge into idol culture, because at least for me, this is definitely where things become most interesting, and pretty bizarre as well. Going back to the 70s, there really isn't that much to touch on, since besides it being the decade where idols really began growing a fan base, considering agencies had such tight control over them that the only times idols would even be seen were brief scripted appearances on TV or radio shows, what fan bases idols had wouldn't be as fanatical as they are today. Though it is important to note that this would be the beginning of official idol fan clubs that would only grow in coming decades. But even in the 70s, there was one pretty major aspect of idol culture that somehow still persists today: the huge amount of restrictions imposed by the agencies. You see, while things would loosen up as the years went by, one of the strongest consistencies from the very beginning with idols would be the image of purity, as it were. Because with agencies going as far as having idols sign actual contracts on the matter, part of the marketing ploy used when it comes to idols is the illusion that they're innocent and available, only further molding their fan bases into a more obsessive state. And that's exactly what agencies want: If anything, that's how the female idol industry survived for the majority of the 90s, through capturing obsessive otaku who'd sink their life savings into merchandise of their favorite idol. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves here. What about the 80s? With the industry booming, there was sure to be some form of idol culture thriving at that point, and there was. However, unlike before, the idol industry of the 80s took a hard mainstream approach, pandering to a variety of people and spreading all throughout Japan, whether it be through commercials, magazines, TV shows, or even video games. Hell, at this point, there would even be fabricated competitions between idols in an attempt to stir up their fan bases and make them even more devoted. Though without a doubt, once the idol industry began to focus mainly on otaku from the 90s onward, idol culture would never be the same again. Plus, once Morning Musume was founded in the late 90s, what had been a waning and niche subculture began to rise once more. So now, let's talk about AKB48, because ever since it was founded in 2004, it's single-handedly become the center point of all idol culture. Now, it's no secret that when compared to typical bands and musical groups you see here in the West, idol groups tend to have a lot of members. But once AKB48 hit the scene, it made normal idol groups look small in comparison, because as of 2015, this group not only consisted of over 130 idols, but if you count all the sister groups made by its founder, then the idol count ramps up to over 300. Though how does that even work exactly? Well, it's pretty much the result of every way idol culture has changed over the past 3 decades, since through combining the otaku-centered approach of the 90s with the mainstream approach of the 80s, AKB48 became a group that could not only perform in multiple places at once, with its members being split into different teams, but also perform daily, supercharging the once waning Japanese idol fanbase. Plus, with AKB48 popularizing handshake events, which allows fans to shake hands and speak briefly with an idol after buying their music, fan devotion reached a whole new level. But at the same time, this wouldn't be without its downsides, because in May 2014, a man who was jealous of how much money idols made actually attacked them at a handshake event, injuring quite a few people with his handsaw before being subdued. Though now that we've talked about idol culture and the industry around it, what about the idols themselves? How do they fare in this more or less factory of an industry? Well, not that great. For starters, remember how agencies actively prevent idols from getting into a relationship so their fans can continue to fantasize about their innocence? Well, while that's already pretty messed up, the way agencies go about enforcing this can be even more disturbing. Like I said, most of the time, idols have to sign a contract on the matter, preventing them from pursuing romantic relationships, but beyond that, agencies have practices that literally keep idols from even pondering the topic. For one, many agencies like to keep their idols completely in the dark about their work schedule, only informing them by the time it'd be too late for the idols to make any plans of their own. And if that doesn't work, another common practice is to just keep them so busy that by the end of the day, they're too exhausted to do anything else, much less go on a date. Even when an idol needs to take as much as a short break from working, they're not allowed to go off premises at all, even if it's for something as small as their favorite snack from a convenience store. Instead, talent agencies will make sure to keep break rooms stocked with just about anything the idol could ever want, as to keep them under their control. Though what happens when after all of that, an idol happens to do the natural thing for their age and enters a romantic relationship? Well, take the whole controversy around AKB48's Minami Minegishi, who after being found out for having a secret boyfriend, ended up both shaving her head and tearfully apologizing in a video to both AKB48 and her fans. Thankfully though, it's not like this is a rule that is just widely accepted, as even Minami's fans jumped to her defense when all of this happened. And while Minami is definitely the most well-known instance of this happening, it's the situations you don't hear about that are even worse. Because most of the time, when idols break this rule, they're not only kicked out of the group they're in, literally losing years years of work and hardship, but they also end up being heftily fined, with one unnamed singer being ordered to pay 650,000 yen for breaking the no dating clause. But believe it or not, there is one glimmer of hope in this situation, because in 2016, when yet another idol was sued for 9.9 million yen due to having a romantic relationship, the court actually ruled in favor of the idol. So at least in that regard, hopefully this will mark more circumstances like these, instead of idols being denied their basic pursuit of happiness. And before we move on from this, believe it or not, there's another side effect to this backwards policy of preventing relationships. Because considering the industry gears idol fan bases to be more on the obsessive side, an alarming amount of idols have had to deal with stalkers. Just take the situation with Mayu Tomita, who after ignoring a creepy fan's advances on social media and returning a gift he sent her, the man confronted her in person and stabbed her 34 times in the neck, chest, and back. Thankfully, she survived the attack and has partially recovered, but as a result, not only does she have a major PTSD from the incident, her injuries now prevent her from pursuing her dream. Of course, this is a very extreme case, and ever since the incident, laws have been passed to prevent it from happening again. But when the idol industry practically encourages fans to become this obsessive, whether they like it or not, more and more people like this will continue to pop up. Though aside from all of that, what happens when an idol becomes too old to be an idol? With many starting from ages as young as 8, idols spend so much time in the industry that by the time it spits them out, there's only a couple places they can go with their extremely specific skill set. In the past, many were able to apply their skills as professional singers, actresses, and even news anchors, but in recent times, with the high amounts of idols being pumped into and out of the industry, many are left adrift, not being able to find a stable job after being an idol due to the high level of competition. And unfortunately, as of now, there really isn't much of a solution to the problem. But so we don't end everything off on such a low note, let's touch on how much the culture and industry surrounding idols has changed over the last few years. For starters, while the classic bubbly groups like Morning Musume, AKB48, and other groups like them do continue to be overly successful all throughout Japan, more and more now, groups have been popping up that specifically challenge the norm of the industry. I mean, just take groups like Baby Metal or Lady Baby, who somehow mix the typical bubblegum pop type music idol groups make with heavy metal of all things. Or how about virtual idols? Especially considering Vocaloid's rise in popularity, in the last decade, they've become a pretty big subset of the industry. So at the end of the day, while the idol industry and its culture can end up being really taxing on the idols themselves, creating a fanbase that practically worships them, there's no denying the fact that for better or for worse, it's a phenomenon that will only continue growing more and more. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, do subscribe, and today's cool thing of the day is a movie called Perfect Blue. Created by the legendary director Satoshi Kon, Perfect Blue, alongside having incredible animation, is an incredible psychological thriller that portrays the struggles idols go through as they try to move on from the industry really well. It's an absolute must-watch, and if you're a fan of Satoshi Kon's other works, you're doing yourself a disservice by not checking it out. So that being said, I'm the RPG Monger, and don't forget that each and every one of you are fantastic.